Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Ag Export Delays session, the session we've all been waiting for or not waiting for, depending on what your perspective is. My name is Jeffrey Bogart. I'm with the Almond Board of California. I'm the moderator for our session today on Ag Export Delays. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Some people say, well, when you define, how do you define tunnel? What's your timeline when you define tunnel? We're going to talk about what that tunnel is, but obviously there are a few issues that impact us more than the global supply chain breakdown. Those of you here and those of you not here know about the delays issue, and the impacts on our industry have been very, very hard felt. And so what we wanted to do today is, with a great panel of experts, try and address not only the problems, because I think most of you have a pretty good idea where the problems are, and we'll talk a little bit about the problems, but it's more, what are some of the solutions? And, you know, as we turn on the radio and as we read the news, there are a lot of suggestions out there what improvements are needed, but, you know, what are the real improvements that we need now? And so that's one of the questions that our panelists will be taking care of today. But we want to, my goal here today is to, you know, educate everybody, give you a chance also to express your concerns. And, you know, this could be potentially even a group therapy session for those of you in the logistics area. I mean, really, I talk to handlers pretty much every day. I talk to logistics staff, and they're just pulling their hair out. And, you know, these people, quite frankly, are doing just an amazing job with their hands tied behind their back, getting product moved. Yes, delayed. They're doing, you know, I think very sometimes innovative things to get product on ships, and I feel for them. And I won't embarrass anybody because I know a lot of the people that I talk to are probably here, but I'm going to ask you all to give a round of applause to our logistics people who are moving the almonds best they can in these very difficult situations. There you go. So that was our first part of group therapy. Okay, that was very good. All right. So let's get down to the nuts and bolts. Before we do that, what I want to do is tell you about our speakers, and I'm going to list just very briefly some of the key problems that we face. Today we have, I think, a very interesting panel that represents all the segments that we really need to hear about on the ag export delays issue for our almonds. First, we have Joshua Woods. He's the Director of Transportation and Contract Warehousing Operations at Blue Diamond Growers. Also, and this is actually very neat, Josh was appointed to the Federal Maritime Commission's National Shippers Advisory Council. So he is really, when you talk about, you know, interfacing with the regulatory agency, which is FMC, he's our representative for the almond industry. So we look forward to hearing from Josh in a minute, and thank you for coming. Next, we have Jonathan Hoff from Monte Vista Farming. Jonathan's also the chair of our ABC Technical and Regulatory Affairs Committee at the ABC. Jonathan has been very vocal about what it's like dealing with our current logistics crisis, and he has sort of in the trenches sort of perspective, but he also has what I think are some interesting ideas for how we can continue to navigate this very, very difficult situation. In the middle, and he said, do I really have to sit in the middle? is Andrew Wong. Andy is our friend and confidant from the Port of Oakland. I talk to Andy. I have him on speed dial, so we talk a lot. One thing I like about Andy, well, there's a lot of things I like about Andy Wong, but he is very frank, and he just has no problem calling it the way he sees it. So I hope that during the question and answer session, we can get into a discussion, a frank discussion about the Port of Oakland, whereas, you know, 85% of our almonds leave the Port of Oakland. But Andy is, his title there is Manager of Business Development and International Marketing for the Port of Oakland. So we'll hear from Andy in a minute. After that, you'll hear from Shad Shearman. Shad is with the Federal Maritime Commission. He's based in Seattle-Tacoma area. You know, we have few regulatory bodies on this subject matter, and the FMC, as you'll hear a lot of discussion about, is the agency that oversees the ocean carriers and implements a lot of the guidelines on what we call detention and demurrage and all these other things that, as you know, the ocean carriers have been taking advantage of in a big way, and not to mention big profits, unfortunately, these days. And then you'll hear finally from Katie Stack. Katie is, you might know her from Grizzly Nut, but also she serves on the board of the Almond Alliance of California. So Katie's going to provide us with, you know, her own perspective from the almond industry, but then also what the Almond Alliance has been doing. And, you know, the Almond Alliance has been doing really an amazing job. I know that they've worked with a lot of you, and Elaine Trevino, who's not here, but of course is moving on to new and better things, as we know, really has done an amazing job to get our voice heard in Washington and in Sacramento on this very difficult issue. So I congratulate the Almond Alliance. I think Aubrey Betancourt here? Yeah, the new director, Aubrey, welcome. We look forward to working with you. Thank you for being here. So basically that's our panel. So before we get started, let me just quickly talk about some of the key issues that we're facing. And again, for most of you, you know this. We've got handler warehouses filling up with product. We've got ocean carriers that have reduced services to Oakland or bypassing Oakland altogether, which is not good for us. We've got delays that are leading to excessive costs for shippers, which I think you all know. Detention and demurrage fees are problems. We have Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021 that's been introduced. And as a matter of fact, it's being voted on right now, I believe, in the House of Representatives. And I don't know if we have a result from the vote, but that's the bill that Congressman Garamendi from California and Congressman Johnson from South Dakota co-sponsored to give more teeth to the Federal Maritime Commission and to help better regulate what's happening with our carriers. And so we may even have news today on that legislation. Ships in Southern California, as you know, are backing up, waiting potentially 3 weeks to get a berth. We only ship about 15% of almonds out of Southern California, but still we use the ports of LA and Long Beach, and so we're concerned about that. One thing I learned, which I think is very interesting, I was at a meeting in Southern California at USC on the global supply chain issue, and the discussion was, we've gone from just in time to just in case type of buying. In other words, the importers are buying a lot just in case they can't get it later. And so you're seeing a lot of congestion at the ports from people overbuying, over-importing. And so, there's this hysteria that's also been developed that we're also part of, the global supply chain crisis. Trucks, chassis, and drivers are in short supply. And then, of course, we've got labor negotiations coming up in, a few months. So besides that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? That's what my dad would always say. Anyhow, so I hate to lay it out, but that's the issues we're dealing with. And so what I'm going to do now is turn it over to our panelists. At the end, we're going to have a discussion, and then I'm going to encourage you all to come up and ask your questions. And I know that our speakers will also be available after the session if you'd rather not ask something publicly. So having said that, again, thank you all for coming. Thank you for all the hard work you're doing. And I'm going to turn the floor over to our friend Josh Woods from Blue Diamond. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everybody. I'll just caveat real quick. I did prepare notes, and they're not showing up here, so in true supply chain fashion, I'm going to wing it, just like many of you know. So I'm Josh. As Jeff mentioned, I'm the Director of Transportation and Warehousing for Blue Diamond Growers. By quick show of hands, who in the room is a shipper of or exporter or importer of almonds? All right, I'm not talking to you guys. You guys already know what's going on. I'm talking to everybody else. No, I'm just kidding. So before we start talking about the light at the end of the tunnel, I think it's really important for us to start talking about how did we get here? As we know, or again, everybody that raised their hand, as you know, a lot of the things that we're talking about today, they were happening before they got a lot of attention, right? So congestion at the ports, long wait times for trucks, congestion at rail ramps. That was all happening before. If you want to label it COVID-19, if you want to label it supply chain chaos, whatever your label is of the day, a lot of those things were happening before now. We started talking about 10, 15 years ago of pending driver shortages, right? Everybody in the room, again, from a supply chain point of view, we've been talking about we need drivers, we need drivers, we need drivers. This one will hit home. Antiquated systems. So again, we talk about ocean carrier systems, how we don't have real-time data, how carriers aren't able to give us the information that we need in order to make good decisions. That's not a new issue. Antiquated systems for ocean carriers have been around forever. And then finally, we've had a step function change in our culture as a civilization. Again, as many as you know, we've gone from brick and mortar shopping, we've transitioned as a civilization to more of the click and ship. the just in time. Get it to me now. A funny story, I got a 7-year-old son, and his default answer for anything, by the way, he hates going to the store, will not go to Target for anything. His default answer is, Dad, let's just DoorDash it. Dad, let's just Amazon Prime it, right? To me, that's indicative of a step function change in our culture. And because of that, we have, I won't say we have, but I would say as a nation, we are now faced with these issues of being a very high consumer. We want products, we want them now, and we want a lot of it. So now, I'm sure everybody in the room has heard everything that I'm going to go through right now. Every day you turn on your TV, you look at your phone, you look at Google News, whatever your source of information is, and you see things like no sign of relief, global supply chain crisis, could last well into February. Who knows? How the supply chain crisis started. Everybody has an opinion about how it works or how it starts now. Supply chain crisis gives shipping industry record profits. Everybody's heard that, right? I think that's old news at this point. But it's getting a lot of attention, so it's important for us to know and to talk about. Supply chain crisis threatens Christmas for Spanish wines. Right? Supply chain's canceling Christmas, right? Big business bosses are warning supply chain issues and inflation are here to stay. Supply chain crisis impacting public schools in San Luis Obispo. We're even taking it down to the elementary level. The supply chain opinion, the supply chain crisis is a labor crisis. Again, differing opinions. Supply chain disruptions may mean crisis for U.S. farms. Now, is there validity in everything that I just showed you? Probably. Is there maybe a little bit of news? Probably. Hopefully, amongst this panel and in this session today, we can at least help everybody make some sense of everything that you're seeing and everything that you're hearing. Again, not the people that held your hands up in the air, because I know you already know, but the people that didn't, hopefully we can help you guys make sense of this stuff. And then, finally, the question, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? You know, I ask myself this all the time. You know, and I'm sure all the supply chain professionals in this room, you understand the pressures that we see and deal with every day. You know, there are two basic rules of life, according to W. Edwards Deming. Change is inevitable, and everybody resists change. Not to pre-read everybody on this panel and everything that we talk about today, but I do think that there is light at the end of the tunnel. I do think that it took us a lot of years to get to where we are. So I think that the light at the end of the tunnel is not as close as all of us think, and the light at the end of the tunnel is not going to look like it did at the beginning. Thanks.
Okay, well, so now we're talking about the light at the end of the tunnel, what it's going to look like. Well, we're going to get into that conversation. Thank you, Josh. That was great. Next up is Jonathan Hoff from Monte Vista. What do you got? What's the experience really in the trenches day to day? What are you seeing?
Yeah, can you guys all hear me? No? All right. Here we go. So I didn't have a nice PowerPoint presentation like Josh. I'm sort of the guy that didn't do his homework over and didn't realize there was a quiz. So came here really just to talk to you about what it's like for a processor dealing with all of these issues, and I think some of the major impacts to the industry and why it's so critical that we navigate our way through this relatively well. I'm not a subject matter expert when it comes to the technical points of really solving the issues at the port or with trucking or those types of things, but I can tell you what it's like to deal with warehouses that are filling up constantly, dealing with issues with respect to continuity of supply with our customers, counterparty risk, quality issues, and a cash conversion cycle that is longer than it's ever been before, making it difficult to pay growers in a time where growers need cash flow more than ever. It's also really, really difficult to keep shipments going and keep filling global consumption needs. And once consumption periods have passed, we don't get them back always. In other words, if we can't get our products into stores in various markets around the world that we're supplying, and we miss a holiday season demand, for example, people don't start eating twice as many almonds later on when our products can arrive at their shelves. And so it's critical that we figure out this puzzle and we keep things going. I think the issues that we're facing are huge, and it's going to require a massive effort from every stakeholder involved, not just in the almond industry, but also in other food industries, export industries, trucking industries, and it just seems so overwhelming right now. I'm glad we have the people on the panel that we do have, because I think that they're going to be a big part of helping us to solve these issues. Every day it seems to get worse. I wish I was going to be the guy who could tell you there's light at the end of the tunnel. I'm the guy who's going to tell you this is a major struggle, and every day it seems to be further and further out of our hands. So that's what I have.
Andy, Port of Oakland. And I can tell you, Andy was walking through the trade show, as I said earlier, and people were stopping him right and left. Hey, you're Port of Oakland, you need to talk. So Andy's, as I mentioned, has been a real good source of information. And Andy, can you give us sort of the realistic picture on the ground in Oakland these days, please?
Sure. You can hear me? Well, thank you for the invitation to come here to speak. I actually have been quite looking forward to this for a couple of weeks. As it was mentioned, 85% of the California almonds do transit through Oakland, and so it is a very important market segment for the port. So I personally take quite a bit of interest in this market segment. I will give you an update on what we look like at the port today. We have only one ship at anchor, and that vessel has quite a bit of rail cargo to come in, so it's actually holding outside until we can get the rail cargo on the pier over to the rail yard. Overall, the situation is slowly actually deteriorating, and the reason is because there is a shortage of chassis right now in the market, which is creating difficult situations for truckers to pick up laden containers. Similar to what is going on in Southern California, containers are sitting at distribution centers for longer than normal, so they're not getting turned back in, which means that the chassis cannot be utilized for other loads. It has deteriorated in the past week, but I think we're still managing on a daily basis. We're going to have some spot shortages, and we have been going out through terminal partners, talking to truckers and importers to please turn your containers as fast as you can. I'm not going to be here to blame any part of the supply chain. It's a very complex issue. Everybody blames everybody else, which in my definition means nobody's to blame. Everyone's a victim of it, and everyone's just trying to cope with it. With respects to just a couple of things I would mention. First is Jeff acknowledged all the logistics people here in the room, and everyone's done yeoman's work. And I hope that the senior people in this room do realize that as you move forward, logistics traditionally has been looked upon as a nuisance or just a pass-through. But really, when you look at some of the big companies who have very complex logistics programs, they have suffered dramatically less than the companies who have traditionally looked at logistics as a pass-through. So I think as we move forward within organizations, we should definitely really consider the value and the strategic alignment of the logistics program with the rest of the business. In terms of light at the end of the tunnel, a lot to be seen. COVID, this new Omicron, I saw a headline, I haven't read the article yet, but Pfizer saying that their vaccination is 25% more protective versus non-vaccinated individuals against Omicron, which is good news. However, we have to remember that congestion is a global situation. It's not just a Southern California problem. It's not just an America problem. This is actually a global problem. Countless articles in the last few days are talking about how major ports in Europe are also facing a lot of skips, Rotterdam, Bremerhaven. So this is going on in Europe. When you look at, Marine Traffic or Vessel Finder, I think those websites right now have been super popular. I think they're shooting up the Google ranks because everybody's trying to figure out where their vessel is. If you just look off the coast of Shanghai, Ningbo, Ho Chi Minh, you'll just see ships parked. It's the same situation all over the world. So this is not anybody did anything here in the United States or overseas. This is just a problem that is existing everywhere. But I think COVID is the Omicron virus is one issue that we're going to have to contend with over the next few months. Ningbo, China, has now gone into quarantine for one of their districts. And if anyone here remembers, Ningbo shut down their terminals for 2 weeks a couple months ago. Well, how does that affect us? I would say at least a quarter to a third of the vessel strings that come across the Pacific call Ningbo. And so if that port isn't open or gets shut down, those ships get delayed. And in Asia, they don't just skip the port. They actually wait because that's where all the cargo is to load to come back to the US or to Europe or anywhere else. So there are a lot of factors. There's no answers. That light at the end of the tunnel, I think if I could tell you that, I'd be a very rich man. Anyone who could tell you that, I'd be a very rich man. But needless to say, at the port, we are working very hard. We're talking to the carriers, we're talking to the government agencies, trying to reestablish the services that we were all used to having, particularly prior to COVID. Those discussions are ongoing. We have had some success on reinstatement of some services, but our goal is to get back to where we were prior to COVID. And that's all I have for right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. And I know I won't ask you any questions now, but I know we're going to want to be talking about the whole issue of getting service back to Oakland, and also our difficulty of getting almonds to other markets, particularly in Europe and in India. So, let's hold on to that discussion for a little bit later. But thank you. As I mentioned, we also have a representative from the Federal Maritime Commission who came down from Seattle, and he brought a suitcase full of water, of rain for us too. Thank you very much. And the FMC, is really sort of at the center of this on the regulatory side. And so, but a lot of us don't know really, what the Federal Maritime Commission does, what is the limit of their authority, but what is also being proposed in terms of potential additional teeth for them at the legislative level. But here, Shadrach is going to talk us a little bit about what they're doing now and some of the investigations that are taking place also currently on some of the carrier issues. So, Shad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff. When I initially said I'd come, I didn't realize Jeff was going to say, tell us how you're going to fix everything, and you've got 10 minutes to do it. Oh, by the way, you need to tell us who you are and what you do first. So I put together slides. I'm not going to go through everything in them, but they will. I've been assured they will be available. And when in doubt, go to fmc.gov. There's a lot of resources out there. Okay. So my name is Shad Sharm. I'm the Seattle area representative. And what that means is I'm the local point of contact for basically everything north of San Luis Obispo, north of Point Hueneme, and all the way up to Adak, Alaska, and down to Guam. We are a tiny agency charged with overseeing the regulation of international trade by sea from a commercial perspective. So for the first part of my career, I was a Coast Guard officer, and we regulated the maritime trade for safety, security. So when I started at the commission about 5 years ago, I thought I knew something about how ships worked and ran. They ran on diesel fuel and or bunker C, depending on the type of vessel. And then I started this job and realized I'd had it all wrong. Security was a financial instrument, and everything runs on cash. And as you are all aware, ocean trade is no different than anything else. So the Commission's job is to make sure that the marketplace for trade is working effectively. But the reality is, through the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of the 80s and the revisions in the 90s, it's largely a deregulated industry. There are some regulations there and available to the Commission, and I'll talk about those. But we, as a country and as a global economy, trust the market to work things out and work out these issues. As a regulator, our job is there to make sure that they're doing so in a competitive way. I'm not going to talk about the Garamendi bill or any of the rest of the legislation to tweak our authorities to manage that, but it is an ongoing discussion and debate on what is that right balance in the economy of how much the government can tell industry and trade on what to do. But I can tell you what we're working on now. One thing to keep in mind is it's a tiny agency. There's 120 personnel, 129 full-time employees. We have locations located mostly in DC with a handful of area representatives out there in the field doing the investigation and the outreach. And we've been very busy lately. What's taking up a lot of my time lately is the interpretive rule for under 46 CFR 545.5, because I'm sure everyone is looking that up right now on their phone. But basically, under the Shipping Act, marine terminals and ocean carriers are required to have just and reasonable practices in handling cargo. Now, in my time in the Coast Guard, I was actually a judge advocate and went through law school. And one of the things you learn in law school is when you have words like just or reasonable, it means you'll never get two lawyers to agree what that means. And there's a lot of attorneys who work at the Federal Maritime Commission. So just and reasonable, the Commission, through a long process, came out with an interpretive rule explaining what the Commission thought just and reasonable was with regard to demurrage and detention. And basically, it was an incentive to move cargo. So when you boil all of it down, and there's literally hundreds of pages that have been spilled on this topic, the purpose of demurrage or detention is to keep cargo flowing. And that's one of our big problems right now is the system is not, cargo is not flowing through the system. So this rule is being very much tested and figured out what that means. But in general, if you're boiling it down, does charging demurrage provide that incentive for the shipper carrier, the shipper or the consignee to move that cargo through the system in a timely manner? So when there is a breakdown, what are your resources? When you're being charged bills that you have no control over or that don't seem fair, just, or reasonable, what can you do? The Commission has a number of resources for you. The area representatives are one of them. I'm your local area representative for the vast majority of you. We also have 2 area reps down in Los Angeles and Long Beach. But please, reach out to me or my colleagues. We're happy to talk to you about what the options are and what the rules are and what you're seeing. Another option is our Consumer Affairs and Dispute Resolution Services, or CATERS for short. And they offer a full range of alternative dispute resolutions from informal discussions. They have the phone numbers on who to talk to without 1-800 numbers that nobody seems to pick up the phone on. As through, if a carrier will agree or whoever you have the dispute with, they can do full-blown mediations or even arbitrations. Then there's also the formal complaint process, which basically if you feel that the cargo handling practices are unfair or unreasonable, you can file a federal lawsuit in front of the Federal Maritime Commission. That process goes up through an administrative law judge, or if you have a small claims, which is defined as, oh, forgive me, I don't have the number in front of me, but I believe $50,000, you can have a more expedited process. But the formal complaints process and the small claims process are still very much litigation. They can be done pro se without an attorney, but the vast majority of people do hire attorneys, go through formal discovery, and it takes a while to do it. But I would encourage you, it is one option to look at if there is a behavior that is egregious. And we have cases where shippers are winning in front of the commission. And also, if you just want to complain to somebody, you can email complaints@fmc.gov. No, that's not the purpose. Complaints@fmc.gov is actually the interface for accessing caters, as well as a way to access the formal or small claims process. I encourage you again, please go to the FMC website or give me a call. I'm happy to talk. So in addition, with COVID-19, the commission voted to open a formal investigation called Fact Finding 29, headed up by Commissioner Rebecca Dye. They were charged with broad authority to look at what was going to be the impact of COVID-19 and what could the commission do to help keep cargo moving. And initially, that was making sure that there were ships still moving and people still to pick up cargo and move them, as due to uncertainty, people were not sure what the impacts were going to be of COVID. That rapidly has morphed into how do we deal with the port congestion that we've been experiencing for the last year, for more than a year at this point. Fact Finding 29 has talked with lots of people, heard from hundreds of participants, including many almond growers and exporters, and is still working on issues such as early return dates, how to get cargo on and off terminals in a timely manner via truck, rail, and every other mode. The results so far include expanding the capability to assist exporters and caters, referring a number of cases to the Bureau of Enforcement for potential civil penalty, as well as the commission has voted to issue a formal policy statement on potential retaliation, because that is a big fear of many people in the trade, as well as beginning a rulemaking process on demurrage and detention billing practices specifically. You can find out more about Fact Finding 29 on the FMC website, and I believe they are still actively meeting to talk about these issues today. In addition, the chairman appointed the managing director, the senior career person at the commission, to head up an audit of demurrage and detention practices. That audit began, I believe, in August, and the initial results have led to 3 recommendations. One, the steamship lines display detention and demurrage charges clearly and prominently on their web pages or customer portal, so hopefully there are a few surprises. 2, develop and document clear internal procedures on detention and demurrage, if they have not done so already, and clearly delineate dispute resolution procedures, contacts, and required documentations on their website. And informally, I've seen some significant changes as the carriers have embraced these recommendations. Finally, the commission has kicked off a data sharing to support the supply chain effort. As a matter of fact, yesterday they held the first Maritime Information Transparency meeting, where Commissioner Bensel had experts from around the industry start talking about what information we can use to improve the flow of cargo through our ports. The expectation is they will develop a report due out in spring of 2022. It will be presented at a Maritime Data Summit. And I'm sure there are more questions, but these are just a few of the things that the commission is working on as we go through. And as you're no doubt aware, and Jeff has mentioned, Congress has been working this issue as well. I can tell you that everybody at the commission realizes that there are significant challenges in the supply chain, and we're out here actively working on it. But the reality is, with 120 people managing this industry, we need your support in the public. The people who are having the problems, please contact us. Let us know what those problems are, so that we can hopefully take action to address those issues as appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you, Shadrach. I appreciate that summary. You know, one of the organizations that's not here today, but we did invite them to join us, was the Ag Transportation Coalition. Peter Friedman, many of you know. I know that many of you in the audience are probably members of Ag TC. The Almond Board is a member of the Ag Transportation Coalition. And Peter Friedman is one of those people that has really carried the torch for our industry. And he's worked very closely with the FMC, with Commissioner Dye, certainly with Congressman Garamendi and all others, to really move the needle on this. And unfortunately, he's vacationing somewhere and couldn't be here today. But you know, I also want to publicly thank the Ag Transportation Coalition and all the work that they've been doing tirelessly. I mean, I get emails pretty much every day from them when there's an update, any update. I'm sure I'll get one as soon as there's a vote today on the Garamendi bill. So just want to thank the Ag Transportation Coalition for all that they do for us. And if you have any questions about what they're doing, they have their conference coming up this summer. So it will be in person in Seattle, Tacoma. So I'm sure we'll have a lot of folks that are going to want to go to that. Our last speaker, batting cleanup, as they say, last but not least, Katie Stack from Grizzly Nut is also a board member of the Almond Alliance of California. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, the Almond Alliance has done some really excellent work on this subject over the last year and a half, and we've worked very closely. You know, we at the Almond Board, we conduct surveys, we collect information from you all, we sort of, you know, filter that down to a few pages, and then we share it with the Almond Alliance and others. And I really want to thank the Almond Alliance for all that they're doing. They issued a statement on Monday, which I thought was very interesting, which actually took all the recommendations that have been put out there by the Ag Transportation Coalition, which there are actually 64 recommended solutions. I have printouts here in front if you want to see that. But the Almond Alliance actually took that and said, well, maybe we need to focus on just these few improvements in the short term. And so during our discussion, we're going to talk more about what are some of the immediate things that we can be doing rather than trying to take all the 64 recommendations at once. But Katie, the floor is yours. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you. I don't know where the light is at the end of the tunnel, but I'm going to try and lighten up the panel here and give some really good solutions that Almond Board's been working on. When we look at the supply chain, you know, you're trying to balance the political side along with the practical. So I think the short-term solutions are something we really have to capitalize on, and then team up and make strategic partners as we're working through the long-term solutions. I know we've talked a lot about we've talked a lot about empty containers. And so one of the short-term solutions that Almond Alliance has been working on, and our new president, Aubrey Betancourt, is we're currently looking for about 100 acres outside of the ports to kind of just sweep out the containers and move them back into exporters' hands. I think that's kind of a twofold solution. As we're finding a lot of blind sailings, and basically what that means is the ships are not stopping at Oakland, they're just kind of moving past them. So really focusing on getting those empty containers filled with almonds back in the port of Oakland, and then getting them on those vessels is a really advantageous solution that we've been working hard on. Another thing that we've been working on is improving the efficiency, mainly on the trucking side. As the truckers pull up, they unload, go back in line. Basically what we're hoping to push is they unload and reload at one stop. So they're skipping that line. And that way we can keep truckers trucking and on the roads. Another huge benefit to the almond industry right now is Elaine Trevino being appointed as the U.S. Trade Representative for Ag. Her value is going to be key, and her leadership is going to be imperative for us to kind of work through ag exports, especially for a specialty crop here in California. And then I would say the most important solution, long-term, is strengthening relationships with our unions and longshoremen at the ports. This really ties into things like the infrastructure bill and having a seat at the table when we're talking about where money is spent and how to recommend automation updates, keeping our ports up to standards. That way we can really focus on long-term solutions. So, yeah, I think that those are the main hitters. And then also working with packers. We need to continue to kind of work together and make those strategic partners, and sharing information constantly with Almond Board, Almond Alliance, kind of moving in the right direction constantly.
Great, Katie. Thanks very much. We really appreciate your comments. And that's a perfect segue to our discussion, because actually the question I'm going to lead off with everybody is, what are some of the most viable solutions in the short term? And, Katie began to address some of those. We have this, I'm going to go back here. Inventory of solutions. The Ag Transportation Coalition came up with 64, as I mentioned before. And as you can see, they cover all different areas, everything from regulatory to, transportation issues, to dealing with chassis shortages, all those things. These are the subject headings of about a 30-page report that developed, I think very interesting information as far as where we need to be making changes, not only for now, but for the long term. And I have some printed versions of this. But as I mentioned before, I think we really, we can sit here all day and talk about, well, we want our ports to be 24/7, or, we hear conversation about, well, the U.S. ports need to be 24/7, or at least the West Coast ports need to be 24/7. We need to do this, we need to do that. But I think we really need to say, well, let's start off with extended hours first, and make sure that works, and because, we have to set goals for our industry and for ourselves that are really attainable. So what I'd like to do now is open up the conversation and get us thinking about really some of the key issues that we see in the short term. We've talked about the need to get, service back to Oakland. We're tired of services being bypassed by carriers that go directly to LA Long Beach. So I'm going to open it up, and we can go down the line or whatever. Josh, you have any ideas about sort of like the most immediate? We'll start with Josh and then go to Jonathan.
Yeah, hopefully we don't do this for every question. But yeah, in the short term, short-term solution, the first thing that pops into my mind, and Andrew mentioned it, and Jonathan mentioned it, is, getting the container ships to come back to Oakland. I mean, 24/7 inland ports and off-port storage yards. That doesn't look good if there's only one ship that's docked in the bay. I think that's for me, short term, that's one of the things that could occur that, at least for the almond shippers in this room, would definitely help our situation.
And we don't have to pass it down. You're right. But anybody can chime in, please.
No, I would agree with that. I think that there are some really huge issues that a lot of these solutions don't necessarily address. I think the consolidation in the shipping industry is something that's been out of our control for a very, very long time, and it's one of the major things that's put us in the position that we're in right now. We just really have a very small number of huge shipping line operators that have a tremendous amount of leverage. I think that we have a tremendous amount of leverage here in that we've got ports that are very, very valuable to them in getting goods into the United States. So some of the solutions that I think are most reasonable are the ones that allow us to leverage that. And impose fines and fees for shipping lines who just aren't participating in making containers available, causing undue congestion and all those types of things, just because, these are ports that these shipping lines need in order to stay viable and to continue making the fat profits they're making right now. So, but it's a big problem. And some of the solutions are neat and probably work for other industries. I can't speak to those other industries, but for the almond industry, adding, a few thousand pounds of additional over-the-road weight really does nothing for us. It really is about additional vessels, additional lanes, and container availability.
Yeah. You mentioned fees. Those of us who follow what's happening in LA Long Beach, Gene Soroka, who's the director of the Port of Los Angeles, is actually very, very outspoken on the issue. He's on television all the time, but he's really been sort of carrying the export torch too. And one of the things that they're looking at implementing is this dwell fee, where if you have containers that are dwelling too long at the port, that there would be a fee imposed on the carriers. They were discussing it. I think there was a revision, or they haven't quite implemented it because they've been getting public input. But I think what I hear is that just the mere fact that one is being discussed has also encouraged some of the carriers to move some of those empty containers out of the port area. But then the question is, where are they going? We need additional space, and so the state of California is trying to free up land and everybody else. But that's, I think, there has to be some sort of penalty for not doing what needs to be done. And so we can talk a little bit more about that. Anybody else want to talk about some of these more immediate solutions? Any of the rest of you?
I just got an update from Aubrey Betancourt that I believe the Shipping Reform Act passed.
Hey! All
Hey!
right.
Thank you.
Still got to go through the Senate, though, right? So all we have is just the House vote.
Yeah.
But that's good. I mean, with apparently no controversy, but it does, suggest that there is. I think it's basically three parts: that the whole detention and demurrage situation be basically certified by the carriers. Because right now, what happens is the ocean carriers. My understanding, I don't do this every day like everybody else does, but they basically just. The computers spit out these invoices for detention and demurrage fees, and they send, you guys owe us this amount of money, and even though it was their fault that the container got, pushed off during their time, or you had to cancel sailing, whatever, they're still passing on those fees to us, and it's up to us in the logistics department and in the accounting department to track and say, no, these fees actually were not our fault, but your fault. And so I believe part of the legislation is to get the ocean carriers to actually certify, not just send an invoice, but to actually confirm that, in fact, some of those charges are real. We know that there's also part of the legislation that talks about requiring that the carriers actually receive export cargo, depending on certain conditions, like if your consignment is going to where they're shipping. Because right now they're just saying, no, I'm just not going to take your cargo. So I haven't seen the final draft. I saw some other drafts of legislation, but I'll be curious to see how this goes, because we really do need some, regulatory reform in this regard. So I'm glad that there's been some movement in Congress today on this very issue that we've been looking at. How about Shad or anybody else? Andy?
So I'm not sure that there's anything that will fix it immediately in the short term. Unfortunately, we've spent over a year digging ourselves into a hole, and it's going to take time to clear up. With that said, there's a lot of things that we're doing actively now to help make things better. And a big part of that is actually talking to one another and building relationships. Like anything else, transportation is a relationship business, and the better your relationships are, and the more that's invested in them, the better the outcomes are for people who spend that time and build those relationships with the carriers and the intermediaries and the truckers and the rest. But more concretely, the Commission has been working on a number of things through Fact Finding 29, the Marine Information Network. And one of the big issues is coming up with standard terminology or lexicon. Yesterday, that was a big part of what the discussion is. Not to go too far into sea stories, but if you talk about what time a vessel arrives, you'll get 6 different answers from 3 different people. If you want to know the arrival for the tugboat company, it's when they have to show up to assist the vessel. You talk to the pilot, it's when they reach the pilot station. You ask the longshore gang, it's when they tie up. So some of these things are very simple, seem very simple, but get very complex depending where you're at. And throughout my Coast Guard career, I had a very different arrival time if I was doing a security boarding versus a marine inspection. For cargo operations, it gets even more complicated because you have so many different parties involved in that transaction. But getting everybody on board so we're speaking the same language is a key first step to resolving a lot of these problems. And I think that in a lot of real ways, better information, better data, better sharing of that data will go a long way to making our ports more competitive and run better.
Thanks, Shad. Andy?
Yeah, I guess sorry, I'm looking at my phone of data here with stuff I wrote down just to talk about. I think first thing I would suggest is look at your terms of sales. If you're going to certain markets and your buyer is dictating the ocean carrier you have to use, have conversations to see if you can collaborate. Oftentimes, they don't know the situation here locally. And for them, they got a special deal, whatever their driver is. But I would suggest to talk to your trading partners and take a little bit more control over your logistics, particularly with carrier selections. On a certain service, there are multiple carriers on that service. They all have different allocations. And if you happen to be working with the carrier with the smallest allocation on the vessel you need, well, you're fighting for a vessel within a vessel. So sometimes, if that ocean carrier is being nominated by your buyer, maybe go back and have that discussion. I've said this in other forums, and I always say that all fixes cost money. There's no free fixes, and other people aren't going to pay for your solutions. But one of the things is, particularly if your load point is far from the port, maybe forward position product closer to the port. One of the big things that we hear in many of the different discussions that I have is the ocean carriers have been changing the vessel cutoff dates. They've been compressing the receiving dates, sometimes giving you 12 hours to load 20 or 30 containers. It's a lot harder to accomplish that feat when you're 4 hours away from the port, as opposed to across the street from the port, where you can have fewer drivers cycling containers, loading them up, bringing the laden in, and pulling out another empty. Of course, that costs money, and it has to pencil out to make sense. But that would be another suggestion that I have given out in the past to look at it. With respects to the services, I have sat down and I have analyzed the services, and I know India has become the largest market here for almonds. And I also know that services into that region have been very inconsistent at best. Part of the reason, just to give a little bit of an explanation, is when you make a booking, you're targeting at a transload point, let's say Singapore, 3 weeks out, which means that if your vessel departs today, you're hoping to catch a vessel that's going to be on time in Singapore for you to transload through Singapore and get to India. Well, if your vessel is 2 weeks late and the connecting vessel showed up on time, well, your cargo got there 2 weeks late, and it's going to sit there, and it's going to then fight for space on subsequent connecting vessels that are already overbooked from this week's vessel cargo. So I look at the lining and saying is that if the carriers aren't taking your cargo, particularly on a non-direct basis, it's a little bit of a blessing in disguise. The reason is that even under normal times, I have seen in my career at certain relay points around the world, cargo sits 6 and 8 weeks. And I don't think anyone wants a container load of almonds sitting in limbo somewhere for 6 or 8 weeks, particularly in an extremely hot and humid environment like Singapore or Malaysia or Colombo, Sri Lanka, which are the 3 main transship points for India. So I think it's better that the cargo stays here in the United States, where you maybe have other options for it. I know that from the port, we are seeing enough capacity into North Asia, China in particular. A lot of it is driven from the fact that a lot of our imports are coming from China, and so the carriers are really protecting those services. So as the sales organizations, look to regain your China market share. I understand that there's some difficulties with some of the current political situations going on, but for me, those are short-term fixes that I would look at. And here's a little bit of bad news. Well, and this is why Jeff says I always say it like it is. We're going to be seeing quite a few vessel skips and vessel skips or slides, as they call it, in the upcoming, I would say, 4 to 6 weeks. Sometimes it's just the naming. The vessel's already 2 weeks behind, so they're just going to, on paper, skip 2 weeks and just sort of get it back on schedule on paper. In other instances, they're literally not going to sail a ship because there's not a ship available. And as we get into the end of the year, I think ocean carriers are trying to get the vessel services back into, at least on paper, back on schedule. How does it affect us? We may not have the services that even we were used to over the next few weeks. We are tracking those blanks very closely, but sometimes they're announced pretty late. So what I'm seeing on long-term scheduling is that The intent is to have many of our services back by the end of January, early February. And that's assuming everything goes smoothly. But I would be remiss if I didn't prepare people and say, let's be even more diligent over the next 6 to 8 weeks with respects to shipping, which means booking out earlier, pulling out equipment as soon as you can. The other thing I hear from many people is that I have a booking for 20 and they suddenly can't cut it to 10 because I already pulled 10 containers. Oftentimes the ocean carriers will be very reluctant to cancel a booking when there's activity against it, meaning that the container's been pulled out. So my suggestion is if you're able to, try to pull out containers as soon as you can to show activity against your bookings to help make that decision very difficult for the ocean carrier to cancel your booking. Just a little bit, few tricks here and there, hopefully, and please reach out. I can offline talk to you about other things that I have learned in my career at the ocean carriers, including running exports. So these would be some of the things that I would mention.
No, and I encourage people, I mean, like I said, the speakers will be here afterwards if you want to ask questions that you'd rather not ask in public. But, I mean, the fact, you get some good tips there. And I can tell you it's been frustrating for us on the almond board staff because we know how difficult it is, and we know that, the global supply chain is broken, and we're thinking, what can we do? And so we took up a collection in the almond board. We passed the hat around just to try and help, and, we came up with our own solution. We thought we need our own ship. So we have the Almond Board Express. As you can see, the Almond Board logo on our own ship. We thought, well, we also get these almonds out. We can guarantee we'll take your exports, but we can't guarantee that they'll make them where they're supposed to go. So anyhow, that's our recommendation. We joke about it, but we know that some people are resorting to, booking their own ships. And so, some of the retailers are doing that. And so maybe the almonds need to be thinking about that too. But right now, it's just, I guess, a dream. But anyhow, moving on. We've got some more questions here that I wanted to put out for you. So let's talk about competitiveness of our ports. I mean, it's embarrassing when we're on these calls and we know that our West Coast ports, from a technology point of view and an IT point of view, are 10, maybe even 15 years behind European ports and some of these other. What do we need to do, like on the information sharing and all that kind of stuff on the basic IT side, to make sure that our shippers have that information? Josh, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Sorry. So I think the sharing of data is, as I mentioned in my presentation, the data. The systems that our ocean carriers have, they're antiquated. The systems, even if we talk about the systems on the ports, antiquated if you're comparing them to some of the more advanced systems that we have internal to our country. And I'll speak from my perspective when it comes to transfer of data. I think at this point there's not a bunch of data that's transferred that's really accurate. And everybody in this room that ships understands that if you don't have accurate data when it comes to all of the things that Shad talked about, like when something's going to arrive, when something's going to sell, like you can't plan as a supply chain, right? So then you have to do the things that Andrew talked about. You got to buffer inventory somewhere. You got to relook at your entire supply chain. I think that from a data perspective, and again, I'll caveat this and say this is a lot of my opinion. As a country, we need to look at data transfer between all of our ports, not just West Coast ports, all of our ports, and our sea freight partners, so all of our ocean lines. We do it all day, every day in the air freight industry. Why can't we do it in the sea freight industry? That's kind of my perspective on it, because that is the only way that, in my opinion, we have one source of the truth and one source or one set of rules of engagement with our ports.
Yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Not necessary, just.
I'll weigh in. I think Jonathan's 100% right, and I think it's important to have skin in the game. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so I think as we're talking about these short-term and long-term solutions, we need to look at working together with our politicians and putting money in the infrastructure bill where it needs to go. And sharing data is a very high priority that we need to definitely look at and improve.
Right.
I'll tag on to that a little bit, and not really related to IT or data gathering, but also in sort of response to Andy and Shad with respect to some of the short-term solutions and how bleak the situation is. I can tell you as a grower and a shipper, this is incredibly frustrating. And my concern is that we don't currently have infrastructure in place or authority in place to put significant pressure on shipping lines for what's going on right now. And I would challenge you guys as the folks who are sitting in the seat responsible for overseeing a lot of this stuff to really think about the future and what it looks like if we end up in a situation like this, to really put the screws to shipping lines who are literally toying with the livelihood of many of the folks who are in this room right now. This is really starting to hurt bad. And we don't see a whole lot of action, and we'd really, really like to. So, I mean, I love the relationship building, the complexity of this issue, but I think on the short-term side of things, we need a sheriff in town, and we need to really put some pressure on the folks who are failing the entire supply chain and fix this problem in the short term. I realize it's a big deal, but you know, the short-term solutions that only add cost and complexity to this supply chain or this value chain, they're too costly, and there's not a lot of meat on the bone right now.
Thanks. You know, I think I've got a couple more questions, and I do want to allow at least 10 minutes for our audience to ask questions, because I imagine you have questions out there too. But thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, we need solutions, and we need them now. So we've got the contract negotiations coming up this summer with the ILWU, labor contract negotiations. I know some people have said, yes, they're concerned about it. Others are like, well, we're not sure that it's going to be terribly difficult. What are your thoughts? Anybody have any thoughts on what's going to be happening? I wasn't here the last time when, of course, we had issues. I wasn't in California at the time, but I know we've got labor issues potentially this summer. Any observations, any crystal balling on that?
I guess I'll
Buckle up.
I'll answer. Obviously, it's an ongoing negotiation. I'm sure they've already started the discussions between the PMA and the ILWU. What I would say is that there's a lot at stake this year, and I think all sides are looking to come to an equitable and quick resolution to it. In terms of if there's going to be disruptions, if there's going to be any labor strife, I think it's very hard to predict. We're still 7 months away from the end of the contract. There's still a long way to go in that regards. And I'm pretty sure that the entire international logistics community is looking at the situation. So, my hope is that it does come to an equitable and smooth resolution and a new contract, in time.
Thanks, Andy. One last question before we open up to the public, and it's sort of, I'm wondering, again, sort of thinking into the future, what is our new normal going to be? I mean, we will get through this eventually, but what's the new normal going to be? I mean, obviously for years we've had some pretty good rates exporting our product, but what, as people begin to plan, I mean, beyond COVID and plan beyond the logistics crisis, what kind of a new normal could we potentially see? Any thoughts? I mean, I'm not going to hold you to it, but I mean, let's think about that.
Yeah, I think that new normal, that's a good question. Who knows at this point, right? The one thing I think we can all be pretty sure of is that new normal doesn't look like old normal. A lot of us, rightfully so, over the last 8 to 10 years, even before, we're experiencing, really, really good rates when we export our products. I think those days are over. One thing that I've seen as I've interacted with all of our carrier partners is, relationships. We've a lot of us in this room have built relationships with steamship lines over time, and now those relationships are now being usurped by data, and so I think the new normal really is a maturation of not only the domestic, a maturation of all of our supply chains. Like how do we use data to help our steamship line partners succeed and vice versa? I think the days of, picking up the phone and calling your account rep and beating on the desk and say, get me on a ship. Like, I think those days are over because they're answering to a higher power now. And that power may be dollars, as Jeff said.
I think I would agree. I think the new normal is no longer low rates. I remember back in about 2006, an export load of waste paper cost $800 to ship out. And almonds at that time would have been even higher than that. And those were $2006. So I think some of the prices that are being paid today, if you factor inflation, they're not so far off from what we have seen in the past. So I think that is something to build into your metrics and into your cost basis as you move forward. I also will agree with Josh with respects to how carriers will manage bookings. As the data becomes more and more available, and you have seen carriers really invest in some of these platforms, does it come down to similarities to booking an airline, an airplane seat? As you get closer to the departure date, the price goes up because capacity is being taken up, and then maybe an hour before the flight they have to drop it because there's a few open seats that they're trying to just sell for above variable cost. Those are some of the interesting things I think we would see as we move forward. I think the relationships from the carrier's perspective, again, I'm going to have to agree with Josh. I think that carriers are going to have to reevaluate how they're deploying their sales forces, and they'll probably segment the businesses overall. From a larger perspective, we do believe that ships will continue to get larger. We'll have larger port calls in Oakland. The size of our port call compared to a year ago has gone up 47%, meaning each ship that comes in offloads and loads 40% more cargo than it did a year ago. And we do believe that that trend is going to continue, and we've seen that subsequent investment in the large cranes over at OICT terminal as well as the Everport terminals, because as a port we have to continue to be big ship ready to be able to survive as we go into the future.
Yeah.
So I think that's some of the new normals.
Katie.
The new normal, I think, is really scary when you put your grower hat on, or even your huller hat on, or your processor. The supply chain is affecting everybody. So with growers, fertilizer costs are going up. There's shortages on chemicals. Just overall, your cultural costs are so high. From the hullers, this is affecting them. Processors are not shipping like they used to. So empty bins are limited. So your huller is calling you wanting empty bins, and you're trying to get things out, and there's no bins. I think we just heard all the struggles from the processing side, and so the new normal is scary. And I think we have to come together as an industry and be focused and united in our plan of attack. And I think that's something we really need to focus on and support our agencies like Almond Alliance, Farm Bureau, WAPA. There's a lot of them, and that's where Almond Alliance is different than others. It's almond specific. So I think getting involved is a huge part of this new normal.
Right. And one of the things we're going to be doing at the Almond Board, which I didn't mention at the beginning, is one of the elements that's been missing from the discussion is really the economic impacts to our industry, the financial impacts to our industry. We've done surveys at the Almond Board that have come up with good anecdotal information and some of those impacts, but we want to measure those a little more deeply. So we'll be doing that over the next few weeks with a survey instrument that we'll actually be taking to visit handlers primarily. But if you're interested in participating in that study, please let me know after the event. We'll be doing that over the next few weeks because we do need to have a little more ammunition in terms of really how we are feeling these impacts and to show, because we've heard a lot of discussion even from AgTC about what they think the impacts are, but we have to really dig in a little bit more. So I don't know, Shad, did you want to do anything before we go to question and answer?
Sure. I think, part of the new normal is the U.S. West Coast enjoyed an oversupply of vessels. And everything I'm hearing is those days are gone. There were a lot more space on ships and a lot more terminal space historically. So we were able to absorb disruptions, and the pricing reflected that. We've seen that has changed. The vessel space is at a premium. Terminal space is a premium, and that's not going to go away. There are ways that we can make it more efficient and move more cargo than we currently are with those assets. But the reality is, even with bigger ships coming online, there's still going to be issues with moving that cargo through the port and through the supply chain in general. And as a result, we're not going to see a return of the days where you have far more carrier space that they're trying to sell than cargo that wants to go on those ships. As a result, I think, unfortunately, as a shipper, the new normal is going to be more competitive in developing those relationships and securing the space on those vessels, and being creative in how you challenge those problems, how you tackle those challenges.
Yeah. Thank you, Shadrach. Thank you all. That really ends the portion of our discussion, and I do want to open it up to questions. We have a microphone up here. If anybody has a question for anybody on the panel or for all the panelists, please do so. Anybody? Sure, if you could, or speak loud so we can hear you, please.
Yeah, I don't need the mic.
Okay.
What is it that the ILWU wants? Like, what are the big issues and the big things that they're going to ask for what's on the table with the ILWU? You said July, June. When was it?
I think the contract's over June 30th.
Okay.
I'm not in on the discussions, so I wouldn't be able to tell you specifically what the union is looking for, and conversely, what is the PMA looking for, right? So I think there's always two sides to every negotiation, but I don't know the specifics.
Just
I see.
comment,
Oh, yeah.
the fuel tax, their governor does not want to do anything about that.
You said the fuel tax, say that again, the status of the fuel tax at the,
Fuel tax is a big issue.
any thoughts on the fuel tax?
Not specifically related to the fuel tax and what it's being used for. I mean, I could talk for hours on my opinion on what it's actually being used for, and it's not probably for roads or infrastructure. But I will say that in terms of the cost of fuel and how inefficient we are with trucking nowadays because of all the port congestion, it is a huge cost. I mean, it used to cost us, I don't know, $450 or whatever to get a load from Denair, downtown nowhere, California, where our plant is, to Oakland. I mean, now sometimes it's $1,350 once you start tacking on the fuel surcharge. So cost of fuel is high in general, but cost of fuel in California is really, really high, and it makes the inefficiency on the trucking side just that much more painful. So yeah, I would love to see that dollar per gallon go towards a whole new freeway just for trucks to go straight to the port, but I doubt that will ever happen.
Any other questions from the crowd? Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, I have a question. Andy, you mentioned that you expect to see larger ships in the open. There are new cranes at OICT that can handle these big 18,000 TEU ships. But we also saw a
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, we at the port are currently undergoing multiple studies that is going to ultimately drive what the land use is for the next 40 years at the port. We are looking at many different aspects of it, including transportation circulation, parking. What is the capacity of the Port of Oakland? How much theoretically can we put through the port? We have other ongoing projects as well. Our Inner Harbor Turning Basin, we're working with the Army Corps right now to widen it so that we can take that next generation of bigger ships. I think with your first question is, as the ships get bigger, does it not create more stress on the assets? And I think that in the short term, yes. We ideally would like cargo to come in at a smooth pace throughout the week, but as the ships get larger, they come in much larger peaks. But over time, as we go through our land use, we will be looking at, what else needs to be done to be able to accommodate those I would say, scenarios that will come in the future. So I don't have an answer today with specifics, but we are absolutely studying this. As you know, we've been working as a port on this for over a year now, from a land use perspective, and how all the other pieces around cargo coming over the dock will be affected. So it is something that we absolutely see the value of looking at.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks for that question. That was actually a multi-part question. I think it needs multi-part answers. But it's 4 o'clock, so we're going to have to end. So what I would like to do is, again, thank Josh Woods, Jonathan Hoff, Andrew Wong, Shadrach Sherman, and Katie Stack for all your great insights. And I mean, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? It sounds like that tunnel's still pretty long, but we appreciate all of your insights. Thank you all for coming today. Give everybody a round of applause. Thank you. And don't forget to give a box of candy to your logistics staff. One other announcement here. Tomorrow morning, the day kicks off at 7:30 a.m. with a continental breakfast and dedicated trade show time on the exhibit floor. Sessions will begin at 8:30, and I encourage you to join the trade show floor for this afternoon's social reception, sponsored by Alschem LLC. Thanks, everybody.